Ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, spinners, winners and Sunday dinners, welcome along to the Joe Spider YouTube channel where we discuss books and little else. And you join me in Victober, where content creators and consumers are not so much encouraged to read Victorian literature as socially compelled to read Victorian literature. It is October and it is time to delve, ladies and gents. And so I thought, as a preface, because I shall be doing throughout all of October, I shall be doing reaction videos to all sorts of Victorian literature. I thought, first of all, it'd be handy to get a decent definition. Of course, the temporal one would be literature produced during the reign of Queen Victoria, which, as I'm sure all of you know, was between the years 1837 to 1901 in God's own country of the British Isles, Albion, Great Britain. But I do have with me, first of all, a dictionary of literary terms and literary theory. If, ladies, you ever happen to stumble into a gentleman's chamber and see something like this clogging his shelves, make an about turn and run away, because these things are horrible and shouldn't be in anybody's rooms. But nonetheless, I have one, and I thought it would be nice, first of all, just to delineate and just make sure that we set out what it is the Victorian period is defined as. So here we have it. The period, the era of Queen Victoria's reign, 37 to 91. A period of intense and prolific activity in literature, especially by novelists and poets, philosophers and essayists. Dramatists of any note are few. Much of the writing was concerned with contemporary social problems, for instance, the effects of the Industrial Revolution, the influence of the theory of evolution, movements of political and social reform. And it is on that which I wish to dwell pretty predominantly today, because our first book, ladies and gents, is Miss Bronte's Wuthering Heights, solely because I wish to do most of my Victorian reading in chronological order, or at least somewhat sequentially. So we start with the early period and the middle period and conclude at the end, as we were all meant to do. I had intended to, as I say, preface it a little bit more in depth with the definition of the Victorian period, but I think personally the aspect of Victorian literature that really sort of grasps me is quite how much beauty was produced in such arrantly horrid backgrounds. So you have people writing on their deathbeds who have 12% of the lung capacity of me and you, whilst tending to 17 children, all of whom have had precisely 115 calories that day, on a bed of straw in the middle of nowhere, where the average temperature is about approximately -6 degrees Celsius. And all of it, almost without fail, is beautiful and admirable prose, which is more than can be said for our contemporary creators, as I'm sure you'll agree. And so we have our start today, which is Miss Bronte's Wuthering Heights, which basically is the story of a gentleman called Heathcliff, who is, what could we say, torridly unfeeling. He has so many propensities to violence. He is largely ignorant. He is brusque. He is large. He is bulky, and he is just so very ignorant of the feelings of others. And then you have Ms. Catherine Linton, whom he falls in love with to some extent, all against a weird backdrop, because, as we've already noted, the Victorian period is defined solely, almost always, as a period that likes to involve lots of characters and all sorts of cornices and curlicues, and there are 17 different people over there, all of whom are given big descriptions, and things often take place in multiple locations, and it's all often very confusing. But this, ladies and gents, boys and girls, is set between two locations, one being Wuthering Heights, and the second being Thrushcross Grange, which Miss Bronte clearly didn't consult an editor when she was writing that, because she'd have said that word out loud and realised that it's trash and the word needs to be changed, because the name for Thrushcross Grange is terrible. You can't even pronounce it as I'm showing now. But at the start of the novel, we have Mr. Lockwood, who is renting the Grange from Mr. Heathcliff, and he happens, out of blind affable and personal curiosity to go to Wuthering Heights one evening, notices that they all live in some quite horrid circumstances. You have Mr. Heathcliff, who is perhaps the most personable of all of them. You have somebody who is referred to as I think she's referred to as Cathy Linton, who is reserved. And then you have Joseph, who Miss Bronte has constantly used the I dialect, so it's nigh impossible to read, which I think is part of the effect. You have Hareton, who is just as ignorant and just as sulky and just as unpersonable and just as uncommunicative. And Mr. Lockwood is attacked by dogs. He is then, because of terrible conditions, forced to stay the night at Wuthering Heights, and notes, as one might, that after reading the diary of, I believe it's Catherine Linton as it's still referred to, something horrid has gone on in that locale. Something horrid has happened. There are notes of despair and destruction and all the like, and he wants to know more, much like we do. And he sees Miss Linton represented as a girl in the window, and she's knocking and wants to come in, and he then says to Mr. Heathcliff, "Sorry if I've woken you up, I've just had the worst nightmare it could ever be possible for a human being to have." And then he then notices that Heathcliff is very, what would you say, sorrowful and seeking of forgiveness, which is a character trait he doesn't know about. And then very quickly goes back to Thrushcroft Grange, which is, I think, it's about 4 miles, just for reference. And his housekeeper, Miss Nellie Dean, upon hearing that Mr. Lockwood has gotten ill from his terrible journey across the moor, decides to spool him quite the story indeed. A sprawling story set across about maybe 80 years or something of that description, where we get Mr. and Mrs. Earnshaw, who live at Wuthering Heights originally. And Mr. Earnshaw has a few kids. He's got Catherine, the original Catherine, and he has a son called Hindley. And one day when he's in Liverpool, he picks up what can only be described as a curb dweller, who would be destined for the workhouse, I assume, around it's set about 1800 and written in 1850. This poor young waif, essentially, that he picks up, whom I think he names Heathcliff, and who he takes pride in raising to the detriment of his other blood children, and this obviously garners him much resentment in that household. And so he becomes a very isolated, very insular, and again, woefully ignorant person that nobody would want to spend more than 5 minutes with. He's, again, gruff and pestiferous and all the other things as usual. But Catherine likes him. Catherine, being young and of that disposition, likes the newness and the gruffness of him. And they're quite devious together. They're probably young children at this point, while they're 10, 15, nothing more than that. But then, upon going to Thrushcroft Grange, the Grange, where they meet the Lintons, they come across, first of all they burst in, they come across Edgar, who is a young, I don't know, pseudo-intellectual, that type of thing. He will presumably grow up to go to university and be wonderful in the House of Commons. And Isabella, who will likely do the same, but with a husband in the House of Commons. And they're attacked by dogs again, and all sorts occurs. But owing to Catherine Earnshaw's injuries, they are invited to stay, or she is invited to stay for 5 weeks at the Lintons, and comes back a snooty hauteur who cares not a jot for the pastoral surroundings in her. All she wants is to observe propriety and to take the mickey out of all those who aren't seen as intelligent. She essentially undergoes a complete and utter character change in the space of 5 weeks, and is very different from that point of view. The crux of the story comes properly, I shall get to the point, Joseph, when it becomes clear that Catherine, who is horrible and self-centred and wants to appear and delights in the admiration of others, but not just one or two others. Every single person she meets, she feels she has to be delighted in her presence. She's not nice and is petulant. But it becomes clear that she will probably marry Edgar Linton, and Heathcliff catches bits and bobs of this and decides, sod the world, I'm off, and goes away for 3 years. Again, we know nothing of this 3 years. The intrigue comes from the isolated nature of Wuthering Heights and Frostcross Grange, so we've got no idea what Heathcliff has done. But he comes back after 3 years, and all of a sudden he is an eloquent, centre-parted, jumper-wearing aesthete that absolutely that can express his feelings, that is bulkier and wealthier, much wealthier. He's clearly gone on an economic. He's clearly mastered an economic venture, which means that he has money coming out of his pockets. And now at Wuthering Heights, you have Hindley Earnshaw, who was old Mr. Earnshaw's rightful son, and who probably still hates Heathcliff. He is a gambler, and he is suddenly, as gamblers most often are, impecunious. Man has no money left, and mortgages the entirety, or at least sort of economically ensures that Heathcliff essentially owns Wuthering Heights and all of its surroundings and its land, because Heathcliff gives him all the money so as to gamble, and then you get all sorts of spools of that. And Miss Bronte does it mostly beautifully. I don't like the I dialect that she has in Joseph, who is a servant for the Earnshaws at Wuthering Heights. He's a servant. He's he's bound up in all sorts of religiosity. He's always sort of taking up the sacraments and ushering all sorts of oaths. And she has him read I dialect, which is Yorkshire nonsense, which I think we ought to do without. But that besides, it's really, really excellent. What is it? 130,000 words. It'll take you a couple of days to get through. This was my first read for Victober. I have 4 sections that I want to just deliberate on a little bit. So we have the first quotation that I will offer you. This is where the original Catherine Linton and Edgar have just moved in, and it becomes very obvious that the marriage isn't going to work because Catherine isn't a very nice woman, nor is Edgar altogether harmonious with her either. So we have this will just give you a sense of the beauty of what Miss Bronte is putting down. So this is the start of the chapter. While Miss Linton moped about the park and garden, always silent and almost always in tears, and her brother shut himself up among the books that he never opened, wearying, I guessed, that's Miss Dean, with a continual vague expectation that Catherine, repenting her conduct, would come of her own accord to ask pardon and seek a reconciliation, and she fasted pertinaciously under the idea, probably, that at every meal Edgar was ready to choke for her absence, and that pride alone held him from running to cast himself at her feet. I went about my household duties, convinced that the Grange had but one sensible soul in its walls, and that lodged in my body. And that is Miss Dean, who, as we say, spins the tale to Mr. Lockwood beautifully, absolutely beautifully. She is always correct, always perspicacious, has the correct moral standpoint on every single situation in this book. And again, she is a character about whom we learn embuggeringly little. I would much prefer for her to have a little bit of a bigger role in this. The second one comes, or the second bit that I want to point out, comes when Heathcliff has, as we specified earlier, made sure that he will inherit Wuthering Heights from Hindley Earnshaw, who begets the son Hindley Earnshaw. And it's, again, just done beautifully by Bronte. The guest was now the master of Wuthering Heights. He held firm possession and proved to the attorney, who, in his turn, proved it to Mr. Linton, that Earnshaw had mortgaged every yard of land he owned for cash to supply his mania for gaming, and he, Heathcliff, was the mortgage. In that manner, Hareton, who should now be the first gentleman in the neighbourhood, was reduced to a state of complete dependence on his father's inveterate enemy, and his lives in his own house as a servant deprived of the advantage of wages, and quite unable to right himself because of his friendlessness and his ignorance that he had been wronged. Again, Bronte is absolutely brilliant at offering you perhaps even 4 or 5 so very complex characters, and offering you 4 or 5 aspects of how they intermingle, and doing that within the space of 1 paragraph just here, in the most beautiful and eloquent way possible. So she ticks 4 or 5 boxes within this. But how long does that take to read out loud? That took me 40 seconds. It will take you 12 seconds to read. We have the next point, which concerns... what does it concern? Injustice and passion. Miss Cathy. Oh, yeah, so this is when... So when Heathcliff runs off with Isabella Linton, so as deliberately to frustrate Catherine and Edgar, they beget a daughter rather, who is very unhelpfully called Cathy as well, which doesn't help for narrative simplicity, but there we are. And then she is young, and as all young people know, much as myself, one of the severe markers of growing up is that is the bearing of grudges by adults, because obviously everything is flippant and ephemeral when you're young, and all of a sudden you meet these people that actually rather enjoy hating people for a long period of time. So she is intrigued by Heathcliff and not the young Hareton, and her father says to her, "Look, Heathcliff's a bad un, he's a wrong un, do not go there," and she is perturbed by her father's ill will towards the other Heathcliff. So he says, "Miss Cathy, conversant with no bad deeds except her own slight acts of disobedience, injustice and passion, rising from hot temper and thoughtlessness, and repenting of on the day that they were committed, was amazed at the blackness of spirit that could brood on and cover revenge for years and deliberately prosecute its plans without a visitation of remorse. She appeared so deeply impressed and shocked at this new view of human nature, excluded from all her studies and all her ideas till now, that Mr. Edgar deemed it unnecessary to pursue the subject." So, and again, you've got 3 characters involved there, and 4 or 5 different tendrils coming off of those 4 characters, and it's done so gorgeously and so eloquently with adhering to all the structure of pacing, and is just as... I'm waxing lyrical now, but it really is quite enthralling. And then the final bit we have is when Cathy and Hareton are... it's weird. Cathy also becomes a little bit intellectually supercilious as well, and Hareton is, again, gruff and can't really read... only knows how to read... barely knows how to read the most rudimentary English. But then all of a sudden she gives that up and essentially takes it upon herself to teach him English. And then there is one evening where Mrs. Nellie Dean comes through and sees them learning together by the fireside, and it's just beautiful. So I reflect, there was never a pleasant or more harmless sight, and it will be a burning shame to scold them. The red firelight glowed onto their 2 bonny heads and revealed their faces, animated with the eager interest of children. For, though he was 23 and she 18, he had so much of novelty to feel and learn that neither experienced nor evinced the sentiments of sober, disenchanted maturity. That sober, disenchanted maturity is marvellous. So that's Wuthering Heights. I won't give it all away, but it's well worth 2 days of your time. This is the Penguin Classic, published, I don't know, it's usually about 2005, all these lot came out, something like that, I think. Early noughties. It's got an introduction which is full of all the Bloomian School of Resentment nonsense that I have run away from at university, full of Freudian psychoanalysis with plenty of Jacques Lacan invoked as well. It's disenfranchising and nebulous nonsense. So rather than dissecting characters, she just refers to, I don't know, Freud and things. Very unhelpful. Virginia Woolf's got an excellent section of this in The Common Reader, where she doesn't so much dissects, but just brushes across Jane Eyre and Wuthering Heights, and she notes that I think she calls the 2 Catherines the most lovable females in all English literature, which might be a bit pinnaclism, but they're not. Little Cathy's lovable, but grown-up Catherine didn't excite me. So that's Wuthering Heights. This is my first of Victober, and the next one, ladies and gentlemen, will be Mr. Dickens. We have a huge... This is just unconstitutionally large. David Copperfield, 850 pages. 1850 this was published, so we are carrying on in our consequential nature. And I shall do this... I'll split this into 2 parts, because that's, as I say, that's positively unlawful. So I'll do maybe 400 or 500 pages, a couple of days, and then I will give a reaction video for that as well. I wanted to mention also that it's been wonderful to hear of the few comments that I got. Plenty of encouragement, people telling me that they liked the video and things of that nature. So thanks very much. I certainly hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll be back in a couple of days to berate Mr. Dickens.